Every year through the 1920s, American doctors wrote 11 million prescriptions for whiskey during Prohibition. The Treasury Department printed special forms. Pharmacists kept the bottles behind the counter. And the disease for which whiskey was most often prescribed was tuberculosis, the same disease that killed 1 in 4 people in the 19th century. Today, we know that alcohol triples your risk of tuberculosis, that it weakens the immune system, that it feeds the very bacillus it was meant to destroy. But for more than a century, doctors handed dying patients a glass of brandy and called it medicine. In the sanatoriums of Europe, tuberculosis patients were given Hungarian wine with dinner and French cognac at bedtime. In America, physicians debated whether whiskey was a stimulant or a poison, often prescribing it either way. And in the patent medicine bottles that lined every pharmacy shelf, alcohol content reached 25%, hidden behind labels promising a cure for consumption. Tonight, we trace this strange and troubling history. From the first sanatoriums to the last prohibition prescriptions, from the doctors who believed alcohol could save lives, to the science that proved it was taking them. This is the story of the TB whiskey prescription. Welcome to the sanatorium. Tonight we're exploring one of the strangest chapters in medical history, the century-long practice of treating the world's deadliest disease with a substance that made it worse. It is a story of good intentions and fatal mistakes, of scientific debate and commercial exploitation, of doctors who genuinely believed they were helping, and patients who had no choice but to trust them. If you're new here, this channel explores how tuberculosis, the disease that killed 1 in 4 people in the 19th century, shaped everything from architecture to art, from fashion to the American West. We follow the White Plague through history, tracing the ways it transformed not just medicine, but culture, society, and the very fabric of human life. If that sounds like your kind of history, consider subscribing. This episode takes us through the grand sanatoriums of the Swiss Alps and the German Highlands, through American pharmacies during Prohibition, and into the laboratories where scientists finally understood what alcohol does to the human body fighting tuberculosis. We'll meet the pioneering doctors who prescribed wine and brandy with absolute conviction, and the reformers who fought to stop them. We'll follow the trail of prescriptions and patent medicines, of medical debates and desperate patients. Now, settle in, find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow. We have a long journey ahead, through candlelit sick rooms and gaslit pharmacies, through sanatorium dining halls and temperance meeting halls, through a world where medicine and poison came in the same bottle. Let's begin. Imagine, if you will, a dining hall in the mountains of Silesia, 1875. Through tall windows, the last light of a winter afternoon illuminates snow-covered peaks. The sun has dropped behind the western ridgeline, leaving the sky streaked with amber and rose. Inside, the air is warm, scented with roasted meat and fresh bread. Gas lamps have been lit along the walls, their soft light reflecting off polished wood and white linen. At long tables covered in starched tablecloths, men and women in evening dress lift crystal glasses filled with deep red wine. The men wear dark suits, high collars, carefully trimmed beards. The women wear silk and velvet, their hair pinned up in elaborate arrangements, their faces powdered to conceal their pallor. They are laughing, some of them, making conversation about politics and art and the gossip of distant cities. Others sit quietly, their faces pale, their portions untouched, their eyes fixed on some middle distance that no one else can see. A waiter moves silently between the tables, refilling glasses from bottles of Hungarian Tokay. He is practiced in his work, attentive but unobtrusive, bending close to each glass with the formal precision of a servant in a grand hotel. But this is not a hotel. And these are not ordinary guests. These are patients. Every person in this room has tuberculosis. The cough that they suppress behind silk handkerchiefs, the fever that rises in the night, the weight that slips away no matter how much they eat. These are the common bonds that unite them. And every glass of wine they drink has been prescribed by their physician. This is Gerbersdorf, the world's first tuberculosis sanatorium. Its founder, Dr. Hermann Bremer, has developed a treatment regime unlike anything the medical world has seen. Fresh mountain air, breathed deeply on long walks through pine forests. Gentle exercise on carefully maintained trails. Abundant food at every meal, meat and butter and cream and eggs, all the rich nourishment that the wasting body craves. And alcohol, Hungarian wine with dinner, French cognac at bedtime. Bremer believes in what he calls the dietetic hygienic treatment. The consumptive body is weak, he reasons, and must be strengthened. Wine stimulates the appetite, ensuring that patients can consume the enormous meals his regime requires. Cognac warms the blood and promotes restful sleep. Together with fresh air and rest, they give the body the strength to fight the disease that is destroying it from within. His patients trust him. Many of them have been told by other doctors that there is nothing to be done, that they should go home and put their affairs in order. Some have travelled across Europe to reach this remote valley, leaving behind families and careers and everything familiar in the desperate hope that the mountains might save them. Here, surrounded by others who share their fate, they find something they had lost. Hope. And so they drink. Wine at 7, cognac at 10. The ritual becomes as much a part of the cure as the mountain air itself. Some will leave Gerbersdorf believing themselves cured. Others will never leave at all. What none of them know, what Bremer himself does not know, is that the alcohol he prescribes with such conviction is doing something to their bodies that no one in 1875 can see. It is weakening the very defences they need most. It is feeding the bacillus that feeds on them. But that knowledge is still decades away. For now, there is only the wine, the cognac, the mountain air, and the desperate hope that somehow it will be enough. This is where our story begins. To understand why doctors prescribed alcohol for tuberculosis, we must first understand what they believed about both. And to understand that, we must enter a world very different from our own. A world before germ theory, before antibiotics, before the microscope revealed the invisible enemies that destroy us from within. In the 19th century, tuberculosis was not merely a disease. It was the disease, the captain of the men of death, as one writer called it. In 1850, consumption was responsible for approximately 1/4 of all deaths in Europe and North America. 1 in 4. Think of that number. In every family of reasonable size, someone was likely dying of it. In every street, in every village, in every city, the cough and the fever and the slow wasting were familiar presences. It killed slowly, painfully, and with terrible certainty. The early stages might last for years. A persistent cough, a low fever in the evenings, a gradual loss of weight that no amount of eating could reverse. Then came the blood, coughed up in handkerchiefs that were quickly hidden. The night sweats that left patients drenched and exhausted by morning. The cavities forming in the lungs, visible on autopsy as great empty spaces where healthy tissue had once been. And no one knew what caused it. This is the most important thing to understand about 19th century tuberculosis. The disease was everywhere, killing millions, and the finest medical minds of the age had no idea why. The prevailing theory held that consumption was hereditary, a weakness of constitution passed from parent to child. If your mother died of it, you would likely die of it too. This seemed obvious. The disease clearly ran in families. What we now understand as transmission within households looked to 19th century eyes like inherited doom. Some physicians believe tuberculosis arose from an imbalance of the humours, that ancient Greek system of medicine that still lingered in the corners of European thought. Others blamed cold air, damp climates, or excessive mental exertion. Artists and poets were thought particularly susceptible. The creative temperament, it was believed, wore down the body's defences. Women were considered more vulnerable than men. The poor were thought to bring it on themselves through dissolute living. The one thing almost all physicians agreed upon was that the consumptive body was fundamentally weakened, and that treatment must focus on building it back up. This is where alcohol entered the picture. In 19th century medicine, alcohol was not primarily understood as a depressant. That understanding would come later, with more sophisticated knowledge of neurology and pharmacology. Instead, alcohol was classified as a stimulant, a substance that quickened the pulse, warmed the blood, and gave strength to the failing body. The evidence seemed clear enough. Drink a glass of brandy and you feel warm. Your cheeks flush with colour. Your heart beats faster. Your appetite awakens. These immediate observable effects were taken as proof that alcohol invigorated the system, that it provided fuel for the body's vital fires. The word cordial itself comes from the Latin word cor, meaning heart. The cordials prescribed by Victorian physicians were almost always alcoholic, and they were meant to strengthen the heart and the entire circulatory system. Brandy, whiskey, port wine, champagne, each had its particular medical application. Brandy for shock and collapse, port for convalescence and exhaustion, champagne for nausea and fever, whiskey for general debility. Dr. Francis Anstey, one of the most respected physicians of Victorian England, wrote an entire book in 1877 titled On the Uses of Wines in Health and Disease. He was no quack, no peddler of patent medicines. He was the founder and first editor of The Practitioner, one of Britain's leading medical journals. He had studied the effects of alcohol carefully, experimentally, scientifically, at least by the standards of his day. Anstey recommended that healthy adults drink up to a bottle of light wine every day. This was not indulgence, this was medical advice, published in respected venues followed by respectable people. For the sick, he prescribed even more. Port wine for exhaustion, champagne for fevers, brandy for shock. The Duke of Northumberland donated large quantities of fine sherry to the Westminster Hospital, and Anstey and his colleagues dispensed it to patients with the same confidence they might have given to any other medicine. And for tuberculosis, for the wasting disease that left patients pale and thin, with racing hearts and night sweats and that terrible cough, alcohol seemed almost logically necessary. If the body was wasting away, it needed building up. If the appetite was failing, it needed stimulating. If the patient was cold, they needed warming. If the vital forces were flagging, they needed quickening. Alcohol did all of these things. Or at least, it seemed to. In 1882, everything changed, and nothing changed. Robert Koch, the German physician, stood before the Physiological Society of Berlin and announced to the world that he had found the cause of tuberculosis. It was not hereditary weakness, it was not bad air or damp climate, it was not moral failing or artistic temperament. It was a bacillus, a tiny rod-shaped bacterium invisible to the naked eye that invaded the lungs and slowly destroyed them. The announcement was sensational. Koch had not merely identified the bacillus, he had proven the connection through rigorous experimental work. He had isolated the organism, grown it in pure culture, used it to infect healthy animals, and recovered it from their diseased tissues. This was germ theory in action, proof that a specific microorganism caused a specific disease. This discovery should have transformed treatment. If tuberculosis was caused by a specific organism, then treatment should target that organism. The old approaches, fresh air, good food, stimulants, seemed suddenly inadequate. The enemy had been identified. Surely new weapons would follow. But Koch's discovery came without a cure. He had identified the enemy, but he had given doctors no new weapons to fight it. In 1890, Koch would announce the discovery of tuberculin, a substance he believed could cure the disease. The announcement sparked a frenzy. Patients flooded into Berlin from across Europe, desperate for the new treatment. But tuberculin failed. It could not cure tuberculosis. Some patients died from the treatment itself. And so the old treatments continued. Fresh air, rest, good food, and alcohol. Some physicians began to question whether stimulants truly helped the consumptive patient. If the disease was caused by a living organism, they reasoned, perhaps treatment should focus on fighting that organism rather than simply strengthening the body. Perhaps alcohol was doing more harm than good. Perhaps it was weakening the very defences the body needed to fight off the invader. But others disagreed vehemently. The body needed strength to fight any invader, they argued. Alcohol provided that strength. The discovery of the bacillus changed nothing about the fundamental logic of treatment. Build up the body, give it the resources it needs, and it will fight off the disease on its own. The debate would continue for decades, in medical journals, at international conferences, in sanatoriums and hospital wards across the world. Meanwhile, the bottles kept coming. Wine at dinner, brandy at bedtime, 1 ounce of whiskey every few hours for acute cases. The prescription pads filled with orders for alcohol, written in the confident hands of physicians who believed they were saving lives. Some of their patients recovered. Many did not. And in the absence of any treatment that actually worked, the argument over alcohol remained unsettled, a question that would haunt medical practice well into the 20th century. The story of alcohol as tuberculosis medicine begins in many ways with a single man and a single conviction. Hermann Bremer was born in Silesia in 1826, into a world where tuberculosis was simply a fact of life. It lurked in every shadow, claimed victims from every family, seemed as inevitable as the changing of seasons. He watched it claim his neighbours, his acquaintances, perhaps his own family members. The records of his early life are incomplete. What we know is that by the time he reached young manhood, Bremer had decided to study botany, and that his studies would take him far from the damp lowlands of Silesia. Before his journey east, Bremer had been diagnosed with consumption. The doctors had given him the usual prognosis, uncertain but not hopeful. He knew the disease. He knew what it did. He knew that most who had it did not survive. Yet as he climbed higher into the Himalayan mountains pursuing his botanical studies, something remarkable happened. His cough began to fade. His strength returned. The thin, cold air that should have strained his damaged lungs seemed instead to heal them. By the time he came down from the mountains, months later, Bremer believed himself cured. This experience would shape everything that followed. Bremer became convinced that altitude was the key, that the low atmospheric pressure of the mountains, the dry, clean air, the absence of the miasmas that were thought to breed disease in lowland cities, all combined to create conditions in which tuberculosis could not survive. He had been dying. The mountains had saved him. Could they save others? He returned to Germany and enrolled in medical school, driven by this single question. His botanical studies were set aside. His life would now be devoted to understanding the disease that had nearly killed him, and to finding a way to defeat it. His doctoral dissertation, submitted in 1854, bore a revolutionary title: Tuberculosis is a curable disease. At a time when most physicians considered consumption a death sentence, Bremer argued that it could be defeated, not through medicines or surgery, but through what he called the dietetic hygienic approach. The elements of his treatment were simple: clean mountain air, regulated exercise, abundant nutrition, and alcohol. Why alcohol? Bremer's reasoning followed the medical logic of his time, but it also drew on his personal experience. In the high mountain villages of the Himalayas, he had observed that the inhabitants drank freely. Fermented beverages were part of their daily diet. He had done the same during his recovery. The alcohol, he believed, had stimulated his appetite, warming him against the mountain cold, helping his body take in the nourishment it needed to fight the disease. Wine and spirits would be central to his treatment, not incidental to it. In 1854, Bremer opened his sanatorium in Gerbersdorf, a small town in the mountains of what is now southwestern Poland. It began modestly: a few cottages, a handful of patients, a regime that his medical colleagues viewed with skepticism at best and derision at worst. The established medical profession did not take kindly to an unknown country doctor, claiming he could cure the incurable. The early years were difficult. Bremer had little money and few supporters. When he published his theories, the respected medical journal The Lancet dismissed them as very crude ideas and unsupported assertions. Other physicians were equally harsh. Mountains and fresh air and good food. This was not medicine. This was wishful thinking dressed up in scientific language. But Bremer persisted. By 1859, he had built a proper kurhaus, a spa house or health resort, with 40 rooms, entertainment facilities, and kitchens capable of producing the enormous meals his treatment required. Patients began arriving from across Europe, drawn by word of mouth, by desperation, by the slim hope that this strange mountain cure might work where everything else had failed. The daily routine was strict and comprehensive. Patients rose early and walked on mountain trails, accompanied by staff who monitored their exertion carefully. Too much exercise could be as dangerous as too little. The balance had to be maintained precisely. They submitted to the Walddusche, the forest shower, standing beneath waterfalls of icy mountain water while Bremer himself supervised. The shock of the cold water, he believed, stimulated the body's vital forces. And they ate. My God, how they ate! Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Each meal was enormous, designed to restore the weight that consumption had stolen from them. Meat and butter and cream and eggs. Rich sauces and heavy pastries. The goal was to overwhelm the wasting process with sheer abundance of nourishment. At dinner, they drank. Hungarian Tokay was Bremer's wine of choice, a rich sweet wine from the volcanic hills of Hungary, believed to have particular restorative properties. Tokay was expensive, prestigious, associated with the courts of European royalty. For patients who had been given up for dead, drinking it felt like a return to civilized life, a statement that they were still people of refinement and taste. At bedtime, French cognac. The cognac warmed them against the mountain cold, promoted sleep, and, Bremer believed, continued the work of stimulation through the night. The alcohol was not incidental to the treatment, it was central to it. Bremer prescribed it as deliberately as he prescribed the mountain walks or the cold showers. Wine stimulated the appetite, ensuring patients could consume the massive amounts of food his treatment required. Cognac warmed the blood and promoted restful sleep. Together, they provided what he called stimulation, a quickening of the vital forces that he believed necessary to fight the disease. And the results seemed to vindicate him. By 1869, Bremer had compiled statistics that seemed remarkable. He had treated 958 patients. Only 4.8% had died, a mortality rate far below what other physicians were reporting. In an era when tuberculosis was considered a death sentence, Bremer appeared to be saving nearly 95% of his patients. Word spread through the medical world. Something remarkable was happening in the mountains of Silesia. Physicians who had dismissed Bremer's ideas began to reconsider. Patients who had been given no hope began making the journey to Gerbersdorf. By the 1870s, the sanatorium had grown to 300 beds, and similar institutions were beginning to appear across Europe. But there were problems with Bremer's statistics that he either did not see or chose not to acknowledge. First, his patients were not representative of all tuberculosis sufferers. They were, for the most part, people of means, wealthy enough to afford months of treatment at a private sanatorium, healthy enough to make the journey to the mountains in the first place. The desperately ill, the very poor, those in the advanced stages of the disease, these patients never arrived at Gerbersdorf. Bremer was treating a selected population, and his results reflected that selection. Second, his definition of success was generous. A patient who left the sanatorium feeling better, who had gained weight and stopped coughing, was counted as improved, or even cured. But tuberculosis is a disease of remissions and relapses. Patients who seem to recover might fall ill again months or years later. Bremer did not systematically track his patients after they left. He did not know how many of his cures eventually died of the disease elsewhere. Third, and most fundamentally, he had no control group. In modern medical research, we compare treatments to placebos or to alternative treatments to isolate the effect of what we're studying. Bremer compared his results to the general mortality of tuberculosis patients, but those patients were different in countless ways from his own. The mountain air, the rest, the food, the alcohol. Which of these was helping? Were any of them helping? Or were his patients simply those who would have recovered anyway? These questions were not seriously asked at the time. The science of clinical trials, of controlled experiments, of statistical analysis in medicine, these were all in their infancy. Bremer had numbers that looked impressive, and that was enough. What Bremer did not know, what no one knew, was that his statistics were incomplete in another way entirely. Many of the patients who left Gerbersdorf improved would relapse within months. The disease had not been cured, it had merely paused. The bacillus remained in their lungs, dormant perhaps, but not defeated. And when it awakened, they died, far from the mountains, uncounted in Bremer's triumphant statistics. And the alcohol that Bremer prescribed so confidently was doing something to their immune systems that would not be understood for another century. Among Bremer's patients in the early 1870s was a young physician named Peter Detweiler. Detweiler had come to Gerbersdorf not as a doctor, but as a dying man. Tuberculosis had taken hold of him, and he sought the mountain cure that was beginning to gain fame across Europe. Under Bremer's care he recovered, or seemed to recover, and in his gratitude and fascination he stayed on as Bremer's assistant. But Detweiler was not content to simply replicate his mentor's methods. He observed, he questioned, he modified. Where Bremer emphasized exercise, the long walks, the cold showers, the active building up of the body, Detweiler came to believe that rest was more important. The consumptive body was exhausted, he reasoned. It needed to conserve its energy for the fight against the disease. Exercise might feel invigorating, but it depleted resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Where Bremer sent patients on long walks through the forest, Detweiler had them lie still on specially designed reclining chairs, wrapped in blankets, breathing the mountain air without exertion. In 1876, Detweiler left Gerbersdorf to found his own sanatorium at Falkenstein, in the Taunus Mountains near Frankfurt. Here, he developed what would become known as the Liegekur, the lying cure. Patients spent their days on balconies and in specially built Lieghallen, lying halls, reclining on chaise longues from morning to night. The image became iconic. Rows of patients wrapped in blankets, arranged on cure porches, their faces turned to the sun or the cold mountain air. This was the sanatorium cure as the world would come to know it. This was the template that Thomas Mann would immortalize in The Magic Mountain. Detweiler's contribution to tuberculosis treatment was significant. He invented the portable sputum bottle, the Blauheinrich or Blue Henry, a glass container that patients could carry with them, preventing the spread of infected sputum. He coined the term Chefarzt, chief physician, to describe the medical director of a sanatorium, a title still used in German medicine today. By 1886, he could report that 132 of his 1,022 patients had been completely cured. But on the question of alcohol, Detweiler remained his mentor's disciple. The sanatorium at Falkenstein, like the one at Gerbersdorf, maintained well-stocked wine cellars. Patients received their prescribed portions of wine and spirits as part of the cure. The tradition had been established, and Detweiler saw no reason to break from it. As the sanatorium movement spread across Europe, alcohol came with it. In Switzerland, where Thomas Mann would later set his great novel, Sanatoriums rose in the Alps around Davos. Their dining halls were described as resembling grand hotels, with ceremonial dinners supplied from well-stocked cellars. Wine with meals was simply part of the routine, as expected as the mountain air and the afternoon rest. The logic remained the same across all these institutions. Wine aided digestion and stimulated appetite. Brandy promoted sleep and warmed the body against mountain cold. For patients who had been given no hope, who had been sent to the mountains as a last resort, the ritual of the evening glass offered something beyond its supposed medical benefits. It offered normalcy, a sense that life continued, that civilized pleasures remained available, that death had not yet arrived. But not everyone agreed. In 1873, a young American physician named Edward Livingston Trudeau received devastating news. He had tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed his brother Francis 3 years earlier had now taken hold of his own lungs. Trudeau knew what this meant. He had watched Francis die, had sat at his bedside through the final months, had seen the coughing and the blood and the slow wasting that consumption brought. Now it was his turn. He was 25 years old. In 1876, too weak to continue his medical practice in New York, Trudeau travelled to the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. He had visited the region before for hunting and fishing, and he loved it. If he was going to die, he wanted to die in a place that meant something to him. He did not expect to recover. He expected to find a peaceful place to end his life. Instead, something unexpected happened. In the cold, clear air of Saranac Lake, Trudeau's health improved. He did not die. He grew stronger. Month by month, the symptoms that had seemed to seal his fate began to recede. The cough faded. The fever subsided. His weight stabilized, then began to increase. Like Bremer before him, Trudeau began to wonder if what had saved him might save others. In 1885, Trudeau opened the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium, the first tuberculosis sanatorium in America. He had studied the European model carefully, reading the works of Bremer and Detweiler, corresponding with physicians across the Atlantic. His treatment would follow their principles: fresh air, rest, abundant food. But on one point Trudeau departed dramatically from his European predecessors. At Saranac Lake there would be no wine cellars, no brandy at bedtime, no Hungarian Tokay with dinner. Trudeau maintained what one historian described as a strict code of personal behaviour that prohibited drinking, smoking and cursing. His patients ate several large meals a day, drank at least 3 glasses of milk, and followed a rigorous schedule of rest and graduated exercise. But alcohol was forbidden. Why did Trudeau reject what his European colleagues accepted? The historical record does not give us a definitive answer. Perhaps he was influenced by the temperance movement that was gaining strength in America during this period. Perhaps he observed something in his patients that made him doubt alcohol's benefits. Perhaps it was simply a matter of personal conviction. Trudeau was known to be a man of strong moral principles. What we know is that Trudeau's approach worked, or at least worked as well as any treatment of the era. The Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium became famous, attracting patients from across America and beyond. By the 1890s, the medical profession was at war with itself over alcohol. The battleground was not just tuberculosis. It was the entire question of whether alcohol had any legitimate place in medical treatment at all. But tuberculosis, as the deadliest disease of the age, became one of the most contested territories. On one side stood physicians like James Barr, who in 1905 addressed the British Medical Association with specific recommendations for alcoholic treatments. Champagne for bilious patients who had vomited. Port wine for long convalescence. Brandy for cases of shock. These were not folk remedies. They were the considered opinions of respected medical men, published in the most prestigious journals of the day. The evidence they cited was clinical experience. At Belvedere Hospital in Glasgow during the typhus epidemic of 1861 and 62, physicians had administered over 62,000 ounces of wine, 8,000 ounces of whiskey, and 2,000 ounces of brandy. Patients had recovered. The alcohol, they believed, had helped. On the other side stood a growing coalition of skeptics, reformers, and temperance advocates. The British Medical Temperance Association, founded in 1876, was composed entirely of physicians who had sworn off alcohol entirely. By 1898, its membership had reached nearly 900 practitioners. These doctors argued that alcohol's apparent benefits were illusory. Yes, it warmed the skin, but only by drawing blood away from the vital organs. Yes, it seemed to stimulate appetite, but it also disrupted digestion. Yes, it promoted sleep, but the sleep it produced was not truly restorative. And increasingly, they argued that alcohol might actually weaken the body's defences against disease. The international congresses against alcoholism, held throughout Europe in the late 19th century, made tuberculosis a central topic. Delegates presented research suggesting that heavy drinkers were more susceptible to consumption than abstainers. They pointed to the high rates of tuberculosis in professions associated with alcohol: brewery workers, bartenders, winemakers. Was this coincidence, or was there a causal relationship? What neither side had was definitive proof. The science of immunology was still in its infancy. No one yet understood how the body fought infection at the cellular level. No one could explain exactly what alcohol did to the alveolar macrophages, the immune cells in the lungs that served as the first line of defense against tuberculosis. That knowledge would not come for another century. And so the debate continued, unresolved. In some sanatoriums, patients drank wine with their meals. In others, alcohol was strictly forbidden. Individual physicians made their own choices based on their own convictions. And patients, desperate, dying, hoping for any cure, took whatever their doctors prescribed. The question would not be settled by the medical profession. It would be settled, in the strangest way imaginable, by the United States Congress. By a constitutional amendment that banned alcohol entirely, and created a loophole that would make medicinal whiskey more common than ever. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal across the entire nation. Saloons closed their doors. Breweries shuttered their operations. Distilleries went dark. An entire industry, as billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of jobs, disappeared overnight. Legally, at least. The temperance movement had won. After decades of campaigning, after marches and protests and sermons and political organising, after the tireless work of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League and countless other organisations, the reformers had achieved their ultimate goal. America would be a dry nation. The arguments for prohibition had been powerful. Alcohol destroyed families. It impoverished workers. It fueled violence and crime. It corrupted politics and degraded public morals. The saloon was an institution of vice, a place where men squandered their wages while their wives and children went hungry. Eliminating alcohol, the reformers believed, would eliminate these evils. But the Volstead Act, the legislation that enforced the 18th Amendment, contained exceptions. Alcohol could still be produced and consumed for religious sacraments. Wine for communion, brandy for certain Jewish ceremonies. Churches across America applied for permits to acquire sacramental wine, and some congregations grew suspiciously large during Prohibition. And alcohol could still be prescribed by physicians for medical purposes. This loophole had been controversial from the beginning. The American Medical Association, which had voted in 1917 to support Prohibition, declaring that alcohol had no scientific value as a tonic or stimulant, now found itself in an awkward position. Its official stance was that alcohol was medically useless, but the law still permitted doctors to prescribe it. The irony was staggering. In 1916, just 1 year before the AMA vote, whiskey and brandy had been removed from the Pharmacopoeia of the United States of America, the official list of scientifically approved medicines. The medical establishment had declared in essence that alcohol had no legitimate therapeutic use. And yet here it was, written into federal law. Physicians could prescribe alcohol for medical purposes. The question was not whether they would use this authority. The question was how many of them would use it, and for what. Within months of Prohibition's start, a system emerged. The Treasury Department, which was responsible for enforcing the Volstead Act, issued special numbered and watermarked prescription pads to licensed physicians. Each form allowed a patient to obtain up to 1 pint of liquor, usually whiskey, every 10 days. The prescription had to specify the ailment being treated. The pharmacist had to record each transaction in a bound register. In the first 6 months of Prohibition alone, 15,000 doctors applied for permits to prescribe medicinal alcohol. The Treasury Department had not anticipated such demand. They printed more forms. They registered more pharmacies. They tried to monitor the flood of prescriptions pouring out of doctors' offices across the country. By the mid-1920s, the numbers had become astronomical. Physicians were writing an estimated 11 million prescriptions for whiskey every year. 11 million in a country with a population of just over 100 million. The process was straightforward, if expensive. A patient would visit their doctor, complaining of whatever ailment seemed most likely to justify a whiskey prescription. The doctor would examine them, or perhaps merely listen to their complaint, and write out the official Treasury form. The patient would then take this form to a licensed pharmacy, where they would receive their pint of medicinal liquor. The cost was significant. Approximately $3 for the doctor's consultation. Another $3 at the pharmacy. In 1920 dollars, this was not cheap, equivalent to perhaps $75 today. But for those who wanted legal alcohol, it was the only option. And the ailments for which whiskey was most commonly prescribed: cancer, heart disease, depression, high blood pressure, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. The same disease that had filled the wine cellars of European sanatoriums was now generating prescription slips in doctors' offices across America. The rationale had not changed. Alcohol was a stimulant. It strengthened the failing body. It helped fight off disease. The fact that the AMA had officially declared this rationale invalid did not seem to matter. Doctors kept prescribing. Patients kept drinking. In 1922, the AMA conducted a survey of its members. The results were revealing and embarrassing. Despite having voted just 5 years earlier that alcohol had no scientific value as a stimulant or tonic, 51% of responding physicians now said they believed in the therapeutic efficacy of whiskey. The official position and the actual practice had diverged dramatically. How did this happen? How did thousands of physicians reverse themselves on a question they had supposedly settled? Some of the change may have been genuine reconsideration. The 1917 vote had been contentious. Not all physicians had agreed. Perhaps the dissenters were simply making their voices heard now that the question had practical consequences. Some may have been rationalization, doctors justifying a profitable practice by rediscovering alcohol's supposed benefits. A physician who wrote 50 whiskey prescriptions a week could earn an additional $150 in consultation fees. In an era when a typical doctor's income was perhaps $5,000 a year, this was significant money. It would be natural to find reasons to believe in the treatment you were prescribing. And some was undoubtedly cynical exploitation. The Prohibition era was rife with physicians who ran what amounted to prescription mills, writing whiskey scripts for anyone who walked through the door with $3 in their pocket. They did not examine their patients. They did not believe in the treatment. They simply wrote prescriptions and collected fees. The Treasury Department tried to crack down. They limited the number of prescriptions a physician could write. They investigated doctors who seemed to be running mills. They revoked permits from the most egregious offenders. But the demand was too great, and the loophole too large to be effectively controlled. Note: from here forward, no more visual cues. Video switches to ambient loop for sleep optimization. The drugstore chain, Walgreens, expanded from 20 stores to 525 during the 1920s. Company legend attributed this growth to the introduction of malted milkshakes at its soda fountains. Historians have suggested that medicinal alcohol sales may have played a more significant role. Whether the doctors who prescribed whiskey for tuberculosis genuinely believed in its efficacy, or whether they were simply taking advantage of a profitable loophole, is a question that cannot be definitively answered. Probably the answer varied from physician to physician, patient to patient, prescription to prescription. Time was ambiguous. The line between medicine and commerce is never as clear as we might wish. For American tuberculosis sanatoriums, Prohibition created a peculiar situation. Unlike the grand European establishments with their wine cellars and ceremonial dinners, most American sanatoriums had already moved away from alcohol as part of treatment. Trudeau's example at Saranac Lake had been influential. The emphasis on rest, fresh air, and abundant food, without stimulants, had become the American standard. Milk, not wine, was the beverage of choice. But some institutions still provided alcohol to patients who requested it. Some physicians still believed in its therapeutic value. And now, under Prohibition, these practices became legally complicated. Sanatoriums that wished to provide alcohol to patients needed special permits. Their physicians needed to write individual prescriptions for each patient who received it. The paperwork multiplied. The scrutiny increased. Federal agents might inspect the records at any time. For many institutions, the solution was simple: eliminate alcohol entirely. The therapeutic benefits, if any, were not worth the administrative burden. By the 1920s, most American sanatoriums had adopted strict rules prohibiting alcohol on the premises. This represented a significant shift from European practice. While patients at Davos still received wine with their meals, while the sanatoriums of the Black Forest and the Alps maintained their well-stocked cellars, patients at Saranac Lake and its imitators lived under something closer to the temperance ideal. The sanatorium, which had begun as a place where alcohol was prescribed, became a place where it was forbidden. Whether this made any difference to patient outcomes is difficult to say. Tuberculosis remained stubbornly incurable. With or without alcohol, patients either recovered spontaneously or they didn't. The disease followed its own logic, indifferent to the debates that raged around it. Some patients resented the restriction. They had been drinking all their lives. Why should they stop now, when they were sick and miserable and might be dying? The evening glass of wine had been one of the few pleasures remaining to them. Now even that was taken away. If physician-prescribed whiskey was the respectable face of alcohol as tuberculosis treatment, patent medicines were its disreputable shadow. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, American pharmacies were lined with bottles promising cures for consumption. Ayer's Cherry Pectoral, Lane's Emulsion, Dr. King's new discovery for consumption. Dozens of others with impressive names and bold claims. Most of them contained significant amounts of alcohol, sometimes as much as 25%, equivalent to a fortified wine. The manufacturers were not required to list their ingredients. The word alcohol rarely appeared on the label. Instead, patients found vague references to natural stimulants or restorative tonics. They drank the medicines faithfully, believing they were taking something medicinal, not realizing they were consuming what amounted to sweetened whiskey. The testimonials were compelling. "I was given up to die of consumption," one advertisement might read. "Then I tried Dr. Smith's miraculous lung tonic. Now I am completely cured." Faces of smiling, healthy-looking people gazed out from newspaper pages and handbills. These people had been saved. You could be saved too. The truth, of course, was different. The cured patients in the testimonials had either recovered spontaneously, as some tuberculosis patients did, or had never had tuberculosis at all. Self-diagnosis was common in an era when medical care was expensive and doctors were scarce. A persistent cough might be consumption, or it might be bronchitis, or a cold that wouldn't go away, or simply the effect of living in a dusty city. The patent medicine worked equally well on all of these because it didn't really work on any of them. What it did do was make people feel better, temporarily. The alcohol warmed them, relaxed them, eased their anxiety about the cough that wouldn't go away. It might even suppress the cough reflex for a while. These effects were real if fleeting. And for people who were desperate, who had no money for doctors, who were looking for any hope at all, they were enough. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act began to change things. Manufacturers were now required to list alcohol and narcotic content on their labels. The most extravagant claims had to be toned down. You could no longer advertise that your product cured tuberculosis if it didn't actually cure tuberculosis. But the medicines themselves remained available, and patients kept buying them. The labels now said contains 18% alcohol, but many patients did not read the labels or did not understand them or did not care. They wanted to believe. And belief, even misplaced belief, was sometimes all they had. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, something was changing in how scientists thought about tuberculosis, immunity, and alcohol. The The connection between heavy drinking and tuberculosis had been observed for decades. Alcoholics seemed to contract the disease more often than moderate drinkers or abstainers. Brewery workers, bartenders, and others in alcohol-related professions had elevated rates of consumption. The temperance advocates had been pointing this out for years. But observation was not explanation. It was possible that the correlation was coincidental, that alcoholics lived in poorer conditions, ate less nutritious food, or had other risk factors that explained their vulnerability. Without understanding the mechanism by which alcohol might weaken the body's defences, the connection remained circumstantial. In the early 20th century, researchers began to investigate more systematically. Animal studies suggested that alcohol consumption impaired the immune response. Mice given alcohol showed less resistance to infections than mice kept sober. Rabbits exposed to tuberculosis bacilli were more likely to develop active disease if they had been given alcohol. These findings were preliminary, and they did not immediately transform medical practice. The studies were small. The mechanisms were unclear, and the medical profession, having prescribed alcohol for generations, was not quick to abandon the practice. But the seeds of doubt had been planted. The confident certainty with which Bremer had prescribed Hungarian wine and French cognac was no longer quite so certain. The question that had divided doctors for decades, whether alcohol helped or harmed the tuberculosis patient, was beginning to have an answer. It would take the discovery of effective antibiotics to finally end the debate. When streptomycin arrived in the 1940s, followed by isoniazid and other anti-tubercular drugs, the question of whether alcohol was a good or bad treatment became irrelevant. There was now a treatment that actually worked. The era of stimulants and rescuers was over. But the legacy of the whiskey prescription would linger, time one's, in the attitudes of physicians toward alcohol, in the regulations that still govern prescription drugs, and in the ongoing relationship between alcohol and tuberculosis, a relationship that modern science has finally begun to understand. We now know something that Hermann Bremer and his contemporaries could not have known, something that would have horrified them if they had. The alcohol they prescribed so confidently was systematically destroying their patients' first line of defense against the very disease they were trying to cure. To understand this, we need to understand something about the human lung that 19th century medicine did not know. The lung is not merely a passive organ for breathing. It is not simply a set of bellows that draws in air and pushes it out again. It is an immunological fortress, guarded by specialized cells that stand watch against any invaders that make it past the nose and throat. These guardian cells are called alveolar macrophages. They patrol the tiny air sacs, the alveoli, where oxygen enters the bloodstream and carbon dioxide exits. These are microscopic spaces, invisible to the naked eye, where the barrier between the air we breathe and the blood that sustains us is only a single cell thick. It is a vulnerable place, and the macrophages are its defenders. When a bacterium enters the lungs, when a tuberculosis bacillus rides in on a droplet of infected sputum, expelled by a coughing patient and inhaled by someone nearby, it is the alveolar macrophages that mount the first counterattack. They engulf the invader. They try to destroy it. They send out chemical signals to summon reinforcements from elsewhere in the immune system. This first response is critical. If the macrophages can contain and destroy the bacillus before it establishes a foothold, the infection is defeated. If they cannot, if the bacillus survives, multiplies, spreads, then tuberculosis takes hold. Alcohol impairs these cells. Not subtly, not slightly. Profoundly. Studies conducted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have revealed the mechanism in devastating detail. Chronic alcohol consumption reduces the number of alveolar macrophages in the lungs. It weakens the ones that remain, making them less efficient at engulfing and destroying bacteria. It disrupts the complex signaling pathways by which these cells communicate with the rest of the immune system. It increases oxidative stress in the alveolar space, creating conditions that favour bacterial growth. In essence, alcohol opens the door and invites the enemy in. The sanatorium patients who raised their glasses of Hungarian wine were, without knowing it, toasting to their own destruction. The research is unambiguous. A systematic review of 43 studies published in the early 2000s found that alcohol use disorder is associated with a relative risk of tuberculosis more than 3 times higher than in the general population. This is not a modest increase. This is not a statistical artifact. This is a tripling of risk. And the relationship appears to be dose-dependent. The more alcohol consumed, the greater the vulnerability. Light drinking may have little effect. Heavy drinking dramatically increases the likelihood of infection and disease. The mechanism works at multiple levels. At the cellular level, as we have seen, alcohol impairs the alveolar macrophages. But there are other effects as well. Alcohol disrupts the integrity of the epithelium, the layer of cells that lines the airways. It impairs the ciliary function that helps clear particles and pathogens from the respiratory tract. It affects the production of surfactant, the substance that keeps the alveoli from collapsing. At the systemic level, chronic alcohol use suppresses the production and function of lymphocytes, the white blood cells that coordinate the adaptive immune response. It impairs the function of neutrophils, another type of immune cell important in fighting bacterial infections. It disrupts the production of cytokines, the chemical messengers that orchestrate the immune response. The tuberculosis bacillus, in other words, faces a weakened and disorganized defense. It is more likely to survive the initial encounter with the immune system. It is more likely to establish a foothold. It is more likely to progress from latent infection to active disease. What makes this especially cruel is that the 19th century physicians were not entirely wrong about alcohol's immediate effects. It did warm the skin. It did stimulate appetite in the short term. It did produce a feeling of well-being, a sense that the body was responding positively. These effects are real. They are observable. Time. Ones, they were what physicians saw when they gave their patients brandy and watched for results. But they are also irrelevant to the disease process. The tuberculosis bacillus is patient. Unlike many bacteria that multiply rapidly, causing acute illness within days, Mycobacterium tuberculosis grows slowly. Its generation time, the time it takes to divide into 2 daughter cells, is approximately 20 hours. Compare this to E. coli, which can divide every 20 minutes. The tuberculosis bacillus multiplies at a fraction of that pace. This means that the battle against tuberculosis is not won or lost in an evening, or even in a week. It is fought over months and years. The bacillus establishes itself slowly, gradually colonizing the lung tissue, gradually destroying it. The immune system responds, containing the infection in some cases, failing to contain it in others. The outcome depends on a long war of attrition. And in that long war, the cumulative effects of alcohol prove devastating. A glass of wine at dinner, a cognac at bedtime, these might seem like small things. The immediate effects fade within hours, but the damage to the immune system accumulates. Day after day, week after week, the macrophages are a little less numerous, a little less effective. The signals between immune cells are a little more garbled. The defense against the bacillus is a little weaker. The sanatorium patients who drank their prescribed alcohol were not doing something that might harm them in a single moment. They were doing something that weakened them gradually over the course of their treatment. Each glass was another small defeat in the invisible war being waged within their lungs. And they had no idea. How could they? The immune system works in silence, beneath the threshold of consciousness. We cannot feel our macrophages working. We cannot sense the battle between our white blood cells and invading bacteria. All we can feel is the warmth of the wine, the relaxation of the cognac, the gentle drowsiness that precedes sleep. The doctors who prescribed alcohol were not villains. They were working within the knowledge of their time, following the best available evidence as they understood it. They watched some of their patients improve, and they attributed that improvement to their treatment. They could not see the invisible damage being done at the cellular level. They could not know what we know now. The individual cellular mechanisms tell only part of the story. The broader picture, the population-level relationship between alcohol and tuberculosis, is equally stark. Modern epidemiologists estimate that more than 8% of global tuberculosis cases are attributable to alcohol use disorder. 8% may not sound dramatic until you consider the scale. Tuberculosis still kills more than 1 million people every year worldwide. 8% of that number represents tens of thousands of deaths. Deaths that might not have occurred if alcohol had not weakened the victim's defences. The relationship works in multiple ways. Heavy drinkers are more likely to be infected with tuberculosis in the first place, perhaps because alcohol-related socialising brings them into contact with infected individuals, perhaps because their weakened immunity makes them more susceptible to initial infection. Once infected, they are more likely to progress from latent infection to active disease. And once sick, they are more likely to have poor outcomes, more complications, more severe symptoms, higher mortality. There is also the question of treatment adherence. Tuberculosis treatment today requires taking multiple medications for several months without interruption. Missing doses allows the bacteria to develop resistance. People with alcohol use disorder are less likely to complete their treatment regimens. They are more likely to develop drug-resistant tuberculosis. They are more likely to spread the disease to others. Looking back at the 19th century through this lens, a troubling picture emerges. The patients at Gerbersdorf and Falkenstein and the sanatoriums of Davos were not randomly selected. They were, for the most part, people of means, wealthy enough to afford months of treatment, educated enough to understand that something might be done. Many of them had probably consumed alcohol regularly before their diagnosis. And at the sanatoriums they consumed more. How many of them would have recovered if the wine and cognac had been replaced with milk and water? We can never know for certain. The controlled studies that would answer this question were never conducted, could not have been conducted in an era before randomized trials became standard medical practice. But the biological evidence suggests that at least some of those who died might have lived. But the story of alcohol and tuberculosis is not simply a story of medical error. It is also a story of the disease itself, of the desperate search for any remedy, any relief, any hope. Consider what it meant to have tuberculosis in the 19th century. There was no cure. There was no treatment that reliably worked. You coughed blood into handkerchiefs that you learned to hide from others. You lost weight no matter how much you ate, your body consuming itself from within. You suffered night sweats that drenched your bedclothes and left you shivering by morning. Fever rose in the evenings and broke before dawn. Exhaustion settled into your bones like lead. And you knew, everyone knew, that most people who had what you had did not survive. The statistics were not secret. 1 in 4. That was the number. 1/4 of all deaths in the cities of Europe and America. You had seen it claim neighbours and friends and family members. Now it was claiming you. In that context, alcohol offered something that pure medical logic cannot capture. It offered comfort. A glass of wine at dinner restored a sense of normalcy, a feeling that civilized life continued even as the body failed. The warmth spreading through the chest felt like health, felt like life, felt like perhaps things might not be as bad as they seemed. A glass of cognac at bedtime brought sleep, or at least a gentler transition into the night. It softened the sharp edges of fear, dulled the awareness of what was happening within. In an era before palliative care as we know it, before morphine drips and hospice philosophy, before the modern understanding that comfort care is itself a form of medicine, alcohol was one of the few tools available to ease the dying. Laudanum was available, certainly, opium mixed with alcohol, but it was expensive and carried its own risks of dependency. Wine and brandy were familiar, socially acceptable, prescribed by physicians with complete confidence. We should not underestimate this. The quality of the remaining life matters as much as its quantity. For patients who were going to die regardless of treatment, and many tuberculosis patients in the pre-antibiotic era fell into this category, the comfort provided by a glass of wine may have been worth more than any marginal change in immune function. There is something cruel about judging the dying for seeking comfort. These were people who had been given no hope, who knew that the most likely outcome of their illness was death, who faced months or years of slow decline. If wine made those months more bearable, who are we to condemn them for drinking it? The problem was that doctors did not prescribe alcohol as palliation. They prescribed it as treatment. They told their patients it would help them recover, not merely help them die more peacefully. They raised hopes that could not be fulfilled. They offered false certainty in place of honest uncertainty. And for patients who might have recovered, for those whose disease was not yet too advanced, whose immune system still had the strength to fight, who might have beaten the odds if given the best possible chance, this false hope may have been fatal. The alcohol weakened them at precisely the moment they needed strength. It opened doors that should have remained closed. We have spoken much of doctors and their prescriptions, of debates among physicians and the evolution of medical knowledge. But we have spoken less of the patients, the men and women who actually drank the wine and whiskey, who trusted their physicians and hoped for recovery. What was it like to be a tuberculosis patient in an era when alcohol was medicine? The accounts that survive suggest a complex experience. For some patients, the prescribed alcohol was a welcome indulgence, a reminder of life before illness, of dinners with friends and celebrations and ordinary pleasures. The glass of wine at dinner tasted like the world they had left behind, the world of health and possibility. It brought back memories of better times, and in bringing them back it made the present more bearable. For others, particularly those who had never been drinkers, the prescribed alcohol was an uncomfortable obligation, something they forced down because the doctor ordered it, not because they wanted it. The taste was unfamiliar, the effects disorienting. They drank it as they might have drunk any other medicine, grimacing perhaps, but trusting that it would help. At the grand sanatoriums, the evening meal with its accompanying wine took on an almost ritualistic quality. Patients dressed for dinner in their finest clothes, those who could still fit into them. They gathered in elegant dining rooms with crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths. They made conversation about art and politics and the news from distant cities. They maintained the forms of civilized society even as their bodies failed them. The wine was part of this performance, a way of insisting that they were still people, not merely patients, not merely the dying. To drink wine at dinner was to participate in ordinary life, to refuse to be defined entirely by disease. It was an act of dignity, of defiance, of hope. Some found genuine comfort in it. The warmth of the alcohol, the softening of anxiety, the easier sleep that followed, these were real benefits, even if they did nothing to cure the underlying disease. The night was less frightening after a glass of cognac. The darkness seemed less absolute. Sleep came more easily, and when it came, it brought respite from the constant awareness of illness. In an era without effective pain management, without the sophisticated palliative care we know today, alcohol served a function that pure medical logic cannot dismiss. It eased suffering. It provided moments of peace. It made the unbearable a little more bearable. Others became dependent. The line between medical prescription and addiction is not always clear, and 19th century medicine did not police it carefully. Patients who arrived at sanatoriums as moderate drinkers sometimes left, if they left at all, thus as heavy ones. The disease gave them permission. The doctors gave them prescriptions. The bottles kept coming, day after day, week after week. The progression from medical treatment to dependency was subtle and insidious. First, the wine at dinner. Then perhaps a glass in the afternoon when the anxiety became too much. Then the cognac at bedtime extended from 1 glass to 2. By the time a patient realized what was happening, the habit was established. And who would tell a dying person to stop drinking when drinking had been prescribed by their physician? How many tuberculosis patients developed alcohol problems as a result of medical treatment? The records do not permit a precise answer. This was not a question that 19th century physicians thought to ask, and even if they had asked it, they might not have recognized the problem. The concept of alcoholism as a disease was still developing. The line between acceptable medical use and problematic dependency was blurred. But the question itself reveals something about the era, about the unintended consequences that flow from even well-intentioned medical practice. The doctors who prescribed alcohol believed they were helping their patients. In some ways, perhaps they were. In other ways, they were creating new problems even as they failed to solve the original one. Among the tuberculosis patients of the 19th and early 20th centuries were many of the era's most celebrated writers and artists. And among these, alcohol often played a complex role, sometimes prescribed, sometimes self-administered, always intertwined with the creative work that made them famous. Consider Edgar Allan Poe, who watched his young wife Virginia cough blood while singing in 1842, and who spent the next 5 years watching her die. Virginia was only 20 years old when the hemorrhage began, and she would die at 24. Poe's drinking intensified dramatically during this period. By his own admission, he was often insensible with alcohol, disappearing for days at a time, reappearing dishevelled and disoriented. Was this self-medication for his grief? Was it a response to his own suspected tuberculosis? Some historians believe Poe showed symptoms of the disease himself. Was it simply the continuation of earlier patterns, exacerbated by unbearable circumstances? The historical record allows no certain answer. What we know is that the years of Virginia's illness and death were the darkest of Poe's life, and that alcohol was deeply involved. Robert Louis Stevenson, at Saranac Lake and throughout his short life, maintained his habits despite medical advice to the contrary. He smoked, reportedly 4 packs of cigarettes a day, and drank freely. He pushed himself physically, travelling to the South Seas when doctors advised against it, living as though the disease might be outrun rather than accommodated. He befriended his physician Trudeau, engaging in long conversations about literature and medicine, but he never fully submitted to the discipline the sanatorium required. He died at 44, far from the Adirondack Mountains that had offered temporary respite. He was in Samoa, in the house he had built on a mountain, in the place he had chosen to make his final stand against the illness that had pursued him all his life. He was opening a bottle of wine when the stroke that killed him struck. It was cerebral hemorrhage, not tuberculosis, that took him in the end, though the years of illness had surely weakened him. Time. Turcus. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, lived their short lives in the shadow of consumption. Their brother Branwell died of tuberculosis in 1848, probably exacerbated by his heavy drinking and opium use. Emily died 3 months later, at 30, having refused all medical attention. Anne died 5 months after that. Charlotte alone survived past 30, only to die in pregnancy at 38, likely of tuberculosis complicated by hyperemesis gravidarum. What role did alcohol play in these deaths? The evidence is fragmentary. Branwell certainly drank heavily. The sisters themselves were more temperate, though patent medicines containing alcohol were commonly used. The disease would have taken them regardless. But the mythology that grew around them, the romantic image of the consumptive artist, often included the glass of wine, the evening cordial, the prescribed stimulant. The romantic image of the consumptive artist, pale, inspired, burning with creative fire, often included a glass in hand. Keats writing his odes by candlelight, Byron at the height of his scandalous fame, Chopin at the piano coughing into his handkerchief. The mythology surrounding these figures blurs the line between their art and their illness, between their creativity and their destruction. We should be careful not to romanticize this. The tubercular artist drinking wine by candlelight makes for a compelling image, but the reality was suffering, was fear, was slow suffocation, as the lungs filled with disease. The alcohol did not make them better writers. It did not make their deaths more beautiful. It may have hastened those deaths, or it may simply have made them more bearable. The line between medicine and escape was never clear. When the sanatoriums closed and the antibiotics arrived, something was lost along with the wine cellars and the cure porches. It was not medical efficacy. The antibiotics were unquestionably better at treating tuberculosis than anything that came before. Streptomycin, discovered in 1943, could actually kill the tuberculosis bacillus. Isoniazid, introduced in 1952, was even more effective. For the first time in human history, tuberculosis was curable, not through rest and diet and wishful thinking, but through chemical compounds that attack the disease at its source. The sanatoriums emptied. Time thus speeds. Patients who had expected to spend months or years in the mountains went home after weeks. The grand buildings that had been filled with the dying became hotels, or were converted into schools, or simply stood empty, their cure porches vacant, their wine cellars silent. It was something harder to name that was lost. A sense of ritual, perhaps. A philosophy of care that attended to the whole person, not merely the disease. The sanatorium had been a place where patients lived for months or years, where their daily routines were structured around healing, where the doctors knew them by name and monitored their progress week by week. The dining room, with its wine and formal dinners, had been part of that comprehensive care. The new treatment was different. Take these pills. Take them for 6 months. Do not miss a dose. Come back for follow-up appointments. The cure was faster, more effective, more scientific. It was also less personal. The patient was not a resident of a healing community. They were a case number, a prescription, a follow-up file. The alcohol had been part of the older model, part of the evening meal, part of the bedtime ritual, part of the comprehensive care that the sanatorium provided. Removing it was medically correct. We know now that the alcohol was doing harm, not good. But something about the experience of being cared for changed when the glass of wine disappeared from the table. Something about feeling attended to, about being part of a healing ritual, about the ceremony of recovery. Perhaps this is sentimentality. The sanatorium regime with its wine and cognac was killing people, or at least failing to save them while giving the impression of treatment. The antibiotics actually worked. No amount of ritual and atmosphere can substitute for effective medicine. A cure porch and a glass of Tokay cannot compete with streptomycin. And yet, the modern study of medicine has begun to rediscover some of what the sanatoriums knew. The importance of the healing environment. The value of attention to the whole patient. Their fears, their hopes, their daily experience of illness. The recognition that care involves more than medication. That human beings need more than pills to heal. These insights, stripped of the alcohol and the pseudoscience, remain valid. Modern hospice care, modern palliative medicine, modern attention to quality of life alongside quantity. These owe something to the sanatorium tradition, even as they reject its specific methods. The wine is gone. But the recognition that dying people deserve comfort, that healing involves more than chemistry, that care must attend to the person as well as the disease, these remain. Today, no physician prescribes whiskey for tuberculosis. The practice has passed so completely into history that it seems almost unbelievable, a curiosity from another age, like bloodletting or trepanning. If you told a modern pulmonologist that doctors once prescribed alcohol for lung disease, they might laugh, or shake their head in disbelief, or simply stare at you wondering if you were joking. And yet the echoes persist. The relationship between alcohol and tuberculosis has not gone away. It has simply reversed, no longer prescribed as treatment, but recognised as a major risk factor for the disease. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where tuberculosis remains a significant public health challenge, alcohol use disorder is one of the major barriers to effective treatment. Russia in particular faces a dual epidemic, rates of both tuberculosis and alcohol use disorder that rank among the highest in the world. The two problems feed on each other, creating cycles of infection and reinfection that public health officials struggle to break. Patients who drink heavily are less likely to complete their medication regimens. Tuberculosis treatment requires months of daily pill taking, and alcohol makes adherence difficult. Missed doses lead to incomplete treatment. Incomplete treatment leads to drug resistance. Drug-resistant tuberculosis spreads to others, creating new cases that are harder to cure than the original. They are more likely to develop drug-resistant strains. Multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, MDR-TB, is one of the most frightening public health challenges of our time. It requires longer, more toxic treatment regimens, and it kills more often than ordinary tuberculosis. Alcohol use disorder is one of the factors that helps create it. The intersection of alcohol and tuberculosis that the 19th century physicians observed, however much they misunderstood it, remains a deadly reality. They saw the connection. They drew the wrong conclusions. But the connection itself was real. There is also the broader question of medicine uncertainty. The doctors who prescribed alcohol for tuberculosis were not charlatans. They were trained professionals, working within respected institutions, following the best available evidence as they understood it. They attended medical schools, read medical journals, discussed cases with colleagues. They were wrong, but their wrongness was not obvious at the time. It took decades of research and the arrival of truly effective treatments to reveal the error. What errors are we making now? What treatments that seem sensible today will future generations regard with the same mixture of pity and bewilderment that we feel toward the whiskey prescription? What confident certainties of our own time will dissolve under future scrutiny? We cannot know. That is the humbling truth. We can only proceed with humility, testing our assumptions, remaining open to evidence that contradicts what we believe. The story of alcohol and tuberculosis is ultimately a story about the limits of knowledge and the consequences of those limits. It is a story about hope, the hope of patients who drank their prescribed wine believing it would save them, the hope of doctors who poured it, believing they were helping. That hope was misplaced. But it was human, and it was real. And it reminds us that our own hopes, our own certainties, our own confident treatments may one day look equally misguided. Let us pause now and consider what we have witnessed tonight. Let the weight of this history settle as the snow settles on the mountains where so many came seeking cures. We began in the mountains of Silesia in 1875, in a sanatorium where tuberculosis patients raised glasses of Hungarian wine and believed they were being healed. We met Hermann Bremer, the young man who came down from the Himalayas convinced that he had found the cure for consumption. We saw him build his sanatorium, establish his reputation, publish his statistics. Those statistics that seemed so impressive at the time, that convinced physicians across Europe that something miraculous was happening in the mountains. We followed his disciple Peter Detweiler, who refined the cure, rest instead of exercise, the lying cure instead of the walking cure, but kept the wine. The tradition was established, and Detweiler saw no reason to question it. We travelled to Davos, where the sanatoriums rose in the Swiss Alps with their wine cellars and their ceremonial dinners. We crossed the Atlantic to Saranac Lake watching. Edward Trudeau chart a different course, fresh air and rest and discipline, but no alcohol. We passed through the strange interlude of Prohibition, when 11 million prescriptions for whiskey were written each year in a nation that had banned alcohol entirely. We saw the doctors who wrote those prescriptions, some believing in what they prescribed, others simply profiting from a profitable loophole. We saw the pharmacists who filled them, the patients who drank them believing they were medicine, the system that evolved around a practice that the medical establishment had officially declared useless. We traced the slow accumulation of evidence, the animal studies, the epidemiological data, the cellular research, that finally answered the question the 19th century could not resolve. We learned what alcohol does to the alveolar macrophages, those silent guardians of the lung, and how that damage translates into a tripling of tuberculosis risk. We understood at last what the patients at Gerbersdorf could never have understood, what each glass of prescribed wine was doing to their chances of survival. And we arrived at our own time, when the relationship between alcohol and tuberculosis is understood as it never was before, when no reputable physician would dream of prescribing whiskey for consumption, when the practice has passed so completely into history that it seems almost unbelievable. This is not a simple story of heroes and villains. The doctors who prescribed alcohol were not evil. They were working within the knowledge of their time. The reformers who opposed them were not always right for the right reasons. Science advanced not through moments of revelation, but through the slow, painful accumulation of evidence over decades. What does this story tell us about medicine, about science, about ourselves? It tells us first that good intentions are not sufficient. The physicians who prescribed alcohol genuinely wanted to help their patients. They observed, they reasoned, they drew what seemed like logical conclusions. And they were wrong. Wanting to help is not the same as helping. This is a lesson that medicine learns and relearns across the centuries. The history of our profession is littered with treatments that seemed logical, seemed helpful, seemed obviously correct, and turned out to cause harm. Bloodletting weakened patients who needed their strength. Mercury damaged the very bodies it was meant to heal. Thalidomide caused birth defects that haunt us still. And alcohol weakened the immunity of patients fighting for their lives. It tells us that the appearance of benefit is not the same as benefit itself. Alcohol warmed the skin, stimulated appetite, promoted sleep. These effects were real and observable. But they were not the effects that mattered. The effects that mattered, the weakening of immunity, the increased vulnerability to infection, were invisible to 19th century observation. We see what we can see. We measure what we can measure. And we draw conclusions from that limited evidence, believing we have understood the whole when we have only glimpsed a part. The warm flush of the patient's cheeks seemed like health returning. The increased appetite seemed like the body gathering strength. These visible signs obscured the invisible destruction happening within. It tells us that tradition can be wrong. The prescription of alcohol for tuberculosis was not the invention of a single eccentric physician. It was a widespread practice, endorsed by medical authorities, taught in medical schools, followed in the most prestigious institutions. The weight of tradition is not proof of correctness. Generations of physicians prescribed alcohol because their teachers had prescribed alcohol, and their teachers before them. The practice seemed to work, or at least it did not seem to fail in any obvious way. Some patients improved, others died. The same was true without alcohol. In the absence of controlled trials, in the absence of the statistical methods we now take for granted, it was impossible to know which treatments helped and which harmed. Tradition filled the void where evidence should have been. And it tells us something about hope, about the desperate need to do something, anything, when faced with a disease that seemed otherwise unstoppable. In the absence of effective treatment, doctors prescribed what they had. Patients took what they were given. Hope sustained them, even when the object of that hope was misplaced. Hope is not nothing. Even misplaced hope has value. It keeps the dying from despair. It motivates them to continue fighting. It makes the unbearable slightly more bearable. The patients who believed they were being healed by their wine and cognac found comfort in that belief. The comfort was real, even if the healing was not. What do we carry forward from this story? We carry the recognition that medicine is a process, not a destination. The answers of today may be the errors of tomorrow. This is not an argument for rejecting medical advice, but for understanding it in context, as the best available approximation of truth, not as truth itself. Every generation of physicians believes, with varying degrees of confidence, that it has finally understood what previous generations got wrong. The doctors of the 1950s believed they had solved the tuberculosis problem with antibiotics. Then came drug resistance. The doctors of the 1980s believed they understood infectious disease. Then came HIV. Each solution reveals new problems. Each answer generates new questions. This is not failure. It is the nature of scientific progress. But it should teach us humility. We carry the memory of patients who trusted their doctors and drank what they were prescribed. They deserve to be remembered, not with condescension, but with compassion. They were doing their best, just as we do our best, navigating uncertainty with the tools available. These were not gullible fools. They were people facing a terrible disease with no good options, who followed the advice of the most educated professionals their society could produce. Their trust was reasonable. Their hope was human. That the trust was misplaced and the hope ultimately futile does not diminish them. It reminds us that we too place our trust in experts. We too hope that our treatments will work, and we too may one day be pitied by future generations who know what we cannot. We carry an awareness that the intersection of alcohol and disease remains medically significant. The tuberculosis bacillus has not disappeared from the world. It still kills more than 1 million people every year. And alcohol use disorder remains one of the factors that enables it, weakening immunity, disrupting treatment, feeding the cycles of infection that public health officials struggle to break. The pattern we have traced tonight, of alcohol making tuberculosis worse, continues to this day. In Russia and Eastern Europe, in homeless shelters and prisons, in marginalized communities around the world, the old combination persists. The whiskey prescription has ended, but the relationship between alcohol and tuberculosis has not. Perhaps, most importantly, we carry a sense of humility. The doctors of the 19th century were educated, thoughtful people who believed they were doing the right thing. History has not been kind to their beliefs. We have no guarantee that history will be kinder to ours. Somewhere in our current medical practice, in our current confident certainties, there may be errors as profound as the whiskey prescription. We cannot know which beliefs will fall. We can only proceed with care, test our assumptions honestly, and remain open to evidence that contradicts what we think we know. There are no easy answers. There never were. And perhaps that is the most important thing to carry forward. The recognition that certainty is often illusion, that knowledge is always provisional, and that the best we can do is try our hardest with whatever tools and understanding we have. The sanatoriums are gone now. The wine cellars have been emptied or converted to other uses. The prescription pads that once demanded whiskey now carry the names of antibiotics and antivirals. But somewhere, in the mountains where patients once lay on cure porches, breathing the thin cold air, the memory persists. In the converted hotels that were once places of healing and dying. In the medical archives that preserve the records of another age. In the human hope that any remedy, however unlikely, might offer salvation. If you were to visit Davos today, you would find a ski resort and conference centre. The cure porches have been enclosed to make hotel rooms. The dining halls where patients raise their glasses of wine now host business executives and winter tourists. The magic mountain that Thomas Mann immortalised has been transformed into something ordinary, something commercial, something that remembers its past only in plaques and museum exhibits. At Saranac Lake, some of the old cure cottages still stand. They are protected now as historical buildings, testaments to an era when tuberculosis shaped an entire town. Trudeau's original sanatorium has been converted into other uses. His laboratory became the Trudeau Institute, still conducting medical research, though now into immunology rather than tuberculosis specifically. His legacy survives, stripped of the whiskey debate that he largely won. The glass of wine at dinner, the cognac at bedtime, these were not merely medical treatments. They were rituals of hope, performed by the dying and those who cared for them, in an age when hope was often all that medicine could offer. Think of what it meant to drink that prescribed wine. To lift the glass, knowing that your physician believed it would help you. To feel the warmth spreading through your chest and believe, truly believe, that it was the warmth of healing. To maintain the forms of civilized dining even as disease ravaged your body. To participate in a communal ritual with others who shared your fate. There was meaning in that glass, beyond whatever physical effects the alcohol produced. That hope was misplaced, but it was real. And perhaps that is the most human part of this story. Not the science that eventually corrected the error, but the hope that sustained it for so long. We are creatures who need to believe in something, who cannot endure hopelessness, who will grasp at any treatment that promises relief from suffering. The whiskey prescription endured not because doctors were foolish, but because patients needed hope and alcohol provided the illusion of it. The glass remains. Not the physical glass. That has long since been broken or recycled or lost. But the memory of what it represented. The desperate search for healing. The trust between patient and physician. The hope that any remedy, however improbable, might be the one that saves us. That hope is with us still. It lives in every patient who asks their doctor for something, anything that might help. In every physician who wishes they had better treatments to offer. In the ongoing human struggle against disease and death, and the terrible uncertainty that surrounds both. Let us return, one final time, to that dining hall in the mountains of Silesia. It is evening. The snow has begun to fall again, visible through the tall windows as white flakes against the darkening sky. The patients have gathered for dinner, dressed in their finest clothes, maintaining the forms of civilization even as disease works within them. A waiter moves between the tables, pouring wine from bottles of Hungarian Tokay. The crystal catches the gaslight, and for a moment the wine glows like amber, like honey, like something precious. The patients lift their glasses. Some of them are laughing, sharing stories of distant homes and distant lives. Others are quiet, their thoughts turned inward. A young woman near the window gazes at the falling snow. An elderly gentleman studies his wine, as if reading something in its depths. They drink. They believe, most of them, that what they are drinking will help them. That the warmth spreading through their chests is the warmth of healing. That the doctors who prescribe this wine know what they are doing. We know now that they were wrong. We know what the wine was doing to their immune systems, to their chances of survival, to the invisible battle being waged within their lungs. We know what they could not know. But we cannot save them. They are beyond our reach, separated by more than a century of time and knowledge. All we can do is remember them. Remember their hope, remember their trust, remember that they were people doing their best in an impossible situation. The wine was not the cure they sought, but perhaps in its way it offered them something else. A moment of normalcy, a sense of civilization persisting, a ritual that connected them to the world they were losing. Outside, the mountains stand as they have always stood, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to human hope, indifferent to the debates of physicians and the fears of patients. The same peaks that Hermann Bremer saw when he built his sanatorium. The same forests that patients walked through, breathing deeply, believing the air would save them. The mountains have outlasted the sanatoriums, outlasted the patients, outlasted the entire era when tuberculosis ruled and alcohol was prescribed as its cure. And so, as the night deepens and the sanatorium dining hall fades into memory, we leave behind the doctors and their prescriptions, the debates and the doubts, the science that came too late to save those who needed it most. But their legacy remains in our understanding of immunity and infection, in our humility about medical certainty, in the ongoing relationship between alcohol and disease that still claims lives today. The story we have traced tonight is not merely history. It is a reminder of how medicine works, of how knowledge grows, of how well-meaning people can do harm while trying to help. It is a reminder to question certainties, to test assumptions, to remain humble in the face of what we do not yet understand. Next time on the Sanatorium, we'll explore another corner of tuberculosis history, but that journey is for another night. For now, rest well. Let the memory of mountain air carry you gently into sleep. Let the distant sound of crystal glasses raised in hope echo into quietness. The wine has been poured and drunk. The patients have retired to their rooms. The snow continues to fall on the mountains where so many came seeking cures they would not find. If you found some measure of peace in tonight's journey, perhaps leave a like or share it with someone who might need it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for remembering with us those who drank in hope and died in ignorance of what they were drinking. Good night.